Yeah, actually it was 3 years in Manitoba. I came to study herbicide-resistant weeds at the University of Manitoba from 1990 to 93. When I left Adelaide in South Australia, it was February and it was 110 degrees, and I arrived in Manitoba and it just happened to be minus 40. When I left Adelaide, the people, the professors at the University of Manitoba said, no point in trying to buy cold clothing in Adelaide. I mean, you're going to end up with something like this. So I came and I arrived in shorts and a t-shirt because it was so hot in Adelaide. Spent the whole day buying clothes. So I run the International Survey of Herbicide-Resistant Weeds, and what we do with that is monitor the scientists around the world that are working on herbicide-resistant weeds. Because we're often growing the same crops and using the same herbicides, and quite often the same weeds are present. So in one country you'll get a spectrum of weeds become resistant. We can warn other people in different countries that this is a potential problem, and we can share information. So there's about 1,700 scientists involved in the survey, and they get to email each other about their research and just share information. I grew up on a sheep station in the middle of Australia. It was 2 inches of rainfall, so it was quite a shock to go to Oregon. I mean, that's a lot of rainfall there. And I've been involved in pest control for 50 years now. That was my mother helping me shoot an emu. we had lots of kangaroos and emus, and this guy here is a little emu that they look like zebras when they're first hatch. So, use this one, I guess. This is Wayne County, Nebraska in 1944. And what they're doing here, they're controlling field bindweed. And they're putting on 22 tons per acre of salt, sodium chloride. I'm not sure what jumble size they use. That was state-of-the-art weed control at that stage of the game. But in about the same time, we saw the introduction of modern synthetic herbicides, the 2,4-D, MCPA, the synthetic auxins. And it really revolutionized weed control, particularly in cereals and in corn. So the ag industry saw that there was big money in this, and they set about to go and discover as many herbicides as they could. And that really started a huge industry. By 1970, we saw the appearance of the first herbicide-resistant weed, and that was common ground salt. And it was in Olympia in Washington State. And it was really of little economic significance. It was in a nursery where they were growing potted plants for the general public, and they were spraying simazine down on the ground to keep the weeds down. And a scientist there by the name of Ryan picked this up as a project and published and said, hey, this is actually about 500 times as resistant to atrazine as the normal susceptible types. And once that was published, there were scientists here in the Midwest and also over in Europe said, we're using a lot of atrazine in corn. And they were getting complaints from growers that they weren't getting control, and they put 2 and 2 together and started doing tests on it and found that they had a number of herbicide-resistant weeds that they hadn't identified in the past. They just hadn't clicked to the fact that they might be resistant. So what is a herbicide-resistant weed? Well, there's an official definition, WSSA. Actually, I've been on the Weed Science Society of America meetings trying to get this definition going, and I really don't care about definitions that much. They took about 20 years to get this, and it's not much of a definition. But really, what herbicide-resistant weeds are weeds that you could normally kill with a herbicide, but they have a genetically changed to a point where they're not killed. So we're not talking about weeds that were never killed by a particular herbicide. We're talking about a genetic change in a population so you can't kill them anymore. And these are actually green foxtail populations. They did this in 1990 up in Canada. There's 4 lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's sprayed across here with 4 times the recommended rate of post, a group 1 herbicide. And you can see that these 2 lines are highly resistant and these 2 are susceptible. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about herbicide resistance. And this is some of the severe problems we have with resistance. This is Roundup Ready corn. They had 3 applications of Roundup in here, and this is giant ragweed, and it's probably about 18 feet tall. So that's a massive problem. So now we have, Roundup Ready ragweed. Prerequisites for resistance. Resistant plants were there from the very beginning. They have genes that confer a resistance mechanism. They're very, very rare. For some herbicides, they might be 1 in a million. For some, they might even be 1 in a billion. And then you get the selection pressure, which is just the herbicide to select out those genes. And resistance is just evolution at work. It's a natural process. And it's fairly well understood now. Herbicides don't create resistance. The individual plants are naturally resistant. They're there even 500 years ago. There were herbicide-resistant weeds in weed populations. It's just that they were there at the 1 in a billion, so very, very rare. And then the herbicides select them out. We talk about weed biotypes quite a lot, and the weed biotype is just a subgroup of weeds that has a different trait. And when we talk about herbicide-resistant biotypes, they have a specific herbicide-resistant gene that causes them to be resistant. And we talk about herbicide-resistant biotypes. So they're just a subgroup of a particular weed species. How is it that weeds become resistant? Well, there's a number of ways in which we have a genetic change in the plant which codes for a change that will cause the plant to be resistant. For a lot of the herbicides initially, for the atrazine type herbicides, we call them the group 5 herbicides. For the ACCase inhibitors, which are the group 1 herbicides, the post type, post, fuselae, the clen, and also for the ALS inhibitors, the group 2, the first rate or pursuit type herbicides. Those 3 groups, we saw the vast majority of cases of resistance were called an altered site of action. So normally what herbicides do is once they move through the plant and get into the cell, they bind to enzymes that are critical. These enzymes are really manufacturing plants to create amino acids and create the building blocks to allow the plant to live. And if you get the herbicide will bind to that enzyme in the spot where it's normally doing its job, it will prevent it from doing its job and the plant eventually dies. But what the plants, the genetic mutations in the plants do is modify the shape of the enzyme so the herbicide no longer binds, but it still does its job. So that's how a lot of weeds become resistant to herbicides. Another way is called gene overexpression. So what happens here is we get a number of copies of the gene that encodes for the production of the enzyme. And so the enzyme that's produced, there might be 10 times as much of that enzyme. So even though you get herbicide in there and it does inhibit some of the enzyme, it doesn't inhibit enough of it. And the plant survives, and as the herbicides get broken down within the plant, it can recover. There's enhanced metabolism. And this is a severe problem in Europe and in Australia, particularly in grasses, where the plants produce chemicals that will break down a wide spectrum of herbicides. And they're the same chemicals we have in its mixed function oxidators that just go around and break down foreign chemicals. And we've seen in Australia with the rigid ryegrass, which I did my work on in 1981, it is resistant to about 140 different types of herbicides because it can break them down very quickly. 11 different groups of herbicides. And that's also a big problem in Europe with blackgrass and also in their wild oak they have a lot of metabolic resistance. There's decreased translocation, and that's where the herbicide which enters the plant doesn't move to the site of action. Usually you're trying to get to that growing tip, which is where all the activity is, the enzyme activity. But if the herbicide doesn't get translocated to it, and quite often it's bound along the floral and xylem, then you don't get to activity. And then sequestration, which is where the herbicide may even get inside the cell, but the cell actively pumps it into vacuoles, which are like the garbage dumps within the cells, and they are no longer available to bind to the enzyme. So they're the ways in which weeds become resistant. I sort of covered this in a way, but for a herbicide to work, it's got to get into the plant, it's got to be translocated to the target protein, which is usually an enzyme. It's got to accumulate at that target protein and bind to it like this. So this is the enzyme, and the herbicide's going to bind to it and prevent that enzyme from doing its job. But the different ways of resistance are reduced penetration, altered translocation, so it doesn't move within the plant. You can have, this is the metabolism, where you have other chemicals that come and chew up the herbicide, or you get an overproduction of the enzyme. Instead of having just X amount of enzyme, quite often you'll get 10, and in some cases now we're seeing 20-fold amount of herbicide amount of enzyme being produced, and that way you don't have enough herbicide to inhibit it. And then you've got this alteration in the shape of the enzyme. Now often, for some herbicides, if you alter the shape of it, then quite often that enzyme doesn't work. So the plant dies anyway. So for some herbicides, altering the shape, or for some enzymes, altering the shape of it is not really an option. But for some herbicide groups, and the enzyme which group 2 herbicides, the ALS inhibitors inhibit, you can alter the shape by many different ways. Actually, we've seen 16 different ways you can alter the shape of the enzyme so the herbicide doesn't bind to it anymore, but it still does its job. So that's why we see so many more weeds become resistant to the group 2 herbicides, the ALS or first-rate pursuit type herbicides. Why worry about resistance? Well, it's economics. If you're getting resistance, you're going to lose herbicide groups, and once you start losing that, you're going to have to go to either less effective herbicides or more expensive herbicides, and in some cases, eventually, you're running out of herbicides. And we're seeing that in parts of Australia. We're seeing that actually in the south of the US, and I'll come to that a bit later. So it's a big economic problem if you get resistance. So looking at the surveys that we run, as I said, there's around 1,700 scientists input data into it. There are 427 unique resistant biotypes. So this is different types of resistant weeds. You might have a ragweed with resistance to glyphosate, that's one biotype. And then you might have a kochia with resistance to the ALS inhibitors, that's another biotype. So there's 427 different types. 232 species, 137 of them are broadleaf plants and 95 are grasses. About 600,000 farmers around the world have herbicide resistance on their farms, and this probably is an underestimation, I think. And there's 11 new biotypes, 11 new unique resistant biotypes discovered per year. And that's been fairly consistent. Oh, I should say, this is the website that you can go to, and it's at weedscience.com. So right here. And you can get almost all of the graphs that I present here today, you can download them from that in PowerPoint and use them in your own presentations. So weedscience.com. And also, if you have questions later on, you think of questions, my email is all over this website. You can email me and say you were here at this talk, and I'll definitely get back to you on any questions you have. This is the global increase, and as I said, about 11 new cases a year. It's surprisingly consistent. I mean, the R-squared on this is very high. So we've seen back the first case around 1970, and we see a lot of these with the triazine-resistant weeds, and then we see a lot of the ALS-resistant weeds or the group 2 resistant weeds, and so on here. But about 11 new cases a year. It looks like it's tailing off up the top, but actually that happens. It's been happening every year. It takes a couple of years before the scientists send the data in. They say, well, we collected the seed 2 years ago, so it was resistant then, but we haven't got the research done yet. So this is actually still continuing on in a straight line. We look around the world, it's the countries that first started using herbicides have the most problems, the ones that use them more intensively. So that's North America, US in particular, all through Europe, and also Australia. We adopted herbicides quite early. They are catching up now in Brazil and Argentina. I go down there once or twice a year and see what's happening with herbicide resistance, and they have a lot of problems with glyphosate-resistant weeds, or Roundup-resistant weeds in their Roundup-ready soybeans. So that's why they're catching up there. China also is getting quite a few resistant weeds. They're generally producing their own generics and they're putting them out cheap, and they have a lot of the Group 2 herbicides there that they're getting resistance to. So if we look at the countries, USA has by far the most resistant weeds. I think it's 143 now. We've got Australia and Canada pretty much on the same track. And I think that's interesting in that both countries started using herbicides about the same time. Both countries have a predominance of wheat, and they're using the same type of herbicides in wheat. They have the different weed species, but they pretty much have tracked the same number of resistant weeds over all this time. I've only selected just a few countries. There are actually 61 countries around the world where we have herbicide-resistant weeds. But I thought I'd put in the developing countries, China and Brazil, and they are just starting to increase now because they've gone away from hand weeding, which they did for right up until about 15 or 20 years ago, and now they're starting to get a lot more resistant weeds. Understanding herbicide site of action is critical to understanding how you're going to manage herbicide-resistant weeds. And the herbicide site of action is just the way in which a herbicide kills a plant. And as I mentioned before, usually it's an enzyme that the herbicide attaches to and kills it. So even though you have many different trade names and many different actual active ingredients, we only have a relatively limited number of sites of action. And if you get resistance to one herbicide, usually the other herbicides that kill in exactly the same way, the plant's also resistant to them. I won't go into much detail on this, but these are the different sites of action within the cell that we've found that the herbicides are acting on. It surprises me there are so many other targets within a plant cell, but we've only found 26 ways of inhibiting plant growth so far. I'm not sure, are you people familiar with this numbering system at all? So this, actually I created this numbering system in 1990 in Canada. And they adopted it, and most of the farmers there know that numbering system, but also the United States has adopted it as well. And now that numbering system is on herbicide labels. The reason why we have this numbering system is we want to make sure that you're rotating between the different numbers, because the herbicides in Group 1, which would be post and fuselade and acclaim, that they all control the weeds in the same way. They inhibit an enzyme called acetyl-CoA carboxylase. So if you use Group 1 herbicides over and over again, eventually your grasses will become resistant to them. So we want you to try and mix that up. And I'll talk more about the herbicide numbering system. And actually, really, I want to point out that it's not just for herbicides. I mean, we have resistance in insects, resistance in fungi, and antibiotic resistance. So we've got a wide number of ways in which organisms become resistant, almost identical to what we see in weeds. And for your insecticides and for your fungicides, this labeling system is also on there. You can go to this website. This is not my website. This is a separate one, but Glyphosate Weeds Crops. Pretty poor naming if you ask me, but Glyphosate Weeds Crops, they have a corn soybean herbicide chart. On that chart, it lists all of the herbicides, but not just the herbicides with a single active ingredient in them, but herbicides that have mixtures. So you can then know which herbicides have which numbers in them and plan accordingly to try and avoid resistance. So as I said, the Group 1 herbicides, they inhibit that enzyme, acetyl-CoA carboxylase. They are the Fusion, Fusilade, Assure 2, Target, Select, Arrow, Post, Post Plus. So all of those kill the plant in the same way. And you'll see this label, this on the label of the herbicide on the first page of the label. And they represent these different groups that kill in exactly the same way. So here you can see it with Harness Extra. So it says group, and then it says 5 and 15. Because Harness Extra has atrazine and acetylchlorine. So, and these two belong to different herbicide groups. They kill the plant in different ways.
So Ian, share with them how insecticides or fungicides would look then on that same label.
Yeah, I mean exactly the same on the insecticide labels, fungicide labels. That it would be group, and then it would have a number, and it would say insecticide or fungicide on here. So exactly the same concept. And you really need to be managing resistance in for insecticides and fungicides, because there are severe problems for them as well. I mean, resistance is just evolution, and it's going to get you no matter what the organism is that you're trying to control.
Is the resistance growth or period of time it takes for them to become resistant as fast as what it is in weeds?
Right, and actually it's faster, and the reason for that, for fungi and also for insects, they have more generations per year. So this is a very good question. With weeds, we generally only have the one herbicide application, so you've only got that one selection pressure. But with insects, you might have 2 or 3 times. With fungi, you can even have up to 5 times, I guess. I know in bananas down in South America, they're putting on 15 applications of fungicide. So they can reproduce very quickly. They go through those selection pressures, and it's almost as if they went through 3 or 4 or 5 years of herbicide application, 3 or 4 or 5 generations. So they become resistant quite a bit quicker. One of the things we've noticed by accumulating the data on resistance from around the world is that some herbicide modes of action or sites of action are more prone to resistance than others. We see this blue line. This is for the photosystem 2 inhibitors, the atrazine, what we used to call the triazines. And we saw in corn, in Europe and the USA, they were the ones that we saw the most herbicide-resistant weeds. And these are weeds like lamb's quarters and pigweed will become resistant to atrazine. Then we saw this rapid appearance here of the group 2 herbicides, the first-rate pursuit, the ALS inhibitors, we call them. They are the most prone to resistance. And I think I mentioned before, the reason for that is that there are so many different ways. There are 16 different ways that we know of. There's probably going to end up be 25 or 30 in the long run, because they're being discovered on a regular basis. There are many different ways in which you can get a genetic mutation to change the shape of the enzyme so the herbicide doesn't bind to it and stop it, but the enzyme still does its job and creates 3 amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, and valine. So that's that enzyme's job. And it still produces those 3 amino acids, but it's not killed by the herbicide. Then we have the grass herbicides. They're also fairly prone. In this case, we've found, I guess it's 9 now, 9 ways in which that enzyme for the grasses can be modified so that it will no longer be bound to by the herbicides. This is an interesting one. This is the black line is for the synthetic oxidants. This is the Bamble or 2,4-D type herbicides. It's taken a long time. We've had these herbicides for the longest period of time. We have seen a number of weeds become resistant to them, but they're generally not widespread. The ALS inhibitors, even with this sharp line here, doesn't really tell the whole story. It's not just that we've seen so many species become resistant, but they are very widespread. It happens in some cases within 4 applications of a ALS herbicide that we see resistance. But with the synthetic oxidants, it takes a long time for resistance to appear, and also we don't see it widespread. Often we see it in a couple of farmers' fields, and even 10 years later we don't see other people getting it. So that's kind of interesting. With glyphosate, it was the same for many years. I mean, glyphosate was very expensive back in the 1974 to the really up until about 1990, I guess. So it was very expensive. And then we saw the introduction of Roundup Ready crops, the soybean in '96, and then corn and sugar beet and cotton. And we saw that the increase in glyphosate usage has really kicked off an increase in herbicide-resistant weeds. Why is this? Is that not on? There we go. If we look here at the crops, we see corn here in the blue, wheat, so there are more herbicide-resistant weeds in wheat, more unique biotypes. Then if we look at soybean and rice here, and then cotton. Even though they don't have as many herbicide-resistant weeds in cotton, down in the south they have some of the most severe economic problems in cotton with herbicide-resistant weeds. So the weeds they have are pretty severe. It's not just in crops though. Herbicides are used in a lot of other situations, on roadsides, railways, and pastures, grapes and orchards. So we see resistance appear in many of these other cases. And actually, if we look at glyphosate-resistant weeds, which a lot of people have an interest in, about half of them appear in orchards and grapes. And so that's sort of a bit of a side interest, I think. If we look at the crops, the number of species. Wheat, there's 63, corn 58, rice 50, soybean 46. So these are the major crops in which we see problems with herbicide-resistant weeds. And different plant families down here have different propensities. So the different weeds can be more prone to resistance than other ones. And in particular, grasses. There are 73 species of grasses that have evolved resistance. And these other ones here, there are a lot of weeds that occur in our fields, so it's not surprising that we see a lot of resistant weeds to them. I would like to point out the Amaranthaceae, which are the pigweeds. We don't have a huge number of species in our fields that are pigweeds, but we have a disproportionate number that are resistant. So pigweed species are very prone to herbicide.
Ian, can you translate what those weeds are to the language that I understand?
Well, actually, I will be coming down a little while to go to the sort of, yeah, I shouldn't be putting that up here, I'm sorry. But yeah, I was trying to translate the 2 points, with the top one with the grasses, the Poaceae, and then the Amaranthaceae, the pigweeds. And they're the two I wanted to make a point with. So if we look around the US, we've got California with 24, I should say. Illinois leads but California's got 24 resistant weeds. A number of them are in pastures and a lot are in rice. But the vast majority of herbicide-resistant weeds occur in the Midwest and the South, and in corn, soybean, cotton, and rice. And here you've got 19, so you're equal number 6 with Kentucky. Herbicide-resistant crops have had a big impact on the ag industry, and I'd like to just go over how they're impacting herbicide resistance. I think everyone's probably seen these types of charts where they were adopted very, very quickly. We've got the soybean, cotton, corn, and sugar beet was pretty much adopted instantly over 2 years, went to 96%. But the reason why they were adopted are all of these here. So I think simplicity is the biggest reason, and Roundup Ready crops did to weed control what this does to chess. Somewhat simplifies it. But simple is not always the best way to go. And this student here had a nice simple solution. He found X. But, the simplest, often the cleverest, usually wrong. impact of Roundup Ready crops. We've seen, I mean, with increasing government regulations, herbicide development is very expensive. It costs a little more than $250 million to bring a new herbicide to market today. Roundup Ready crops made weed control very cheap. So companies looked at that and said, hey, we can't justify spending $250 million on a product, and it's got to go and compete with Roundup, which is what people are using there. They can't get their money back. And they really have to have, if you're going to develop a new herbicide, you can't develop it for sugar beet, you can't develop it for minor crops, potatoes. You have to have it in corn, soybean, rice, or cotton. Or wheat, I should say, in cereals as well. So it has to be in a major crop for it to pay back. So the companies really shut down their discovery programs after they saw that glyphosate was being adopted so widely in those crops, in most of those crops. And it's a serious situation because the primary way in the past that we have dealt with herbicide-resistant weeds is to look to industry to come out with a new herbicide site of action, a new way of controlling them. I mean, we went from atrazine, and we still use a lot of atrazine in corn, but we saw triazine-resistant weeds, so we went on to the ALS inhibitors, the soot, and the first-rate type herbicides, and then we got resistance to them. And a number of other herbicides came along, but glyphosate actually cured a lot of our resistance problems to those, but it's creating its own problems. We saw this lack of diversity here. We've got, this is in soybean, and the sites of action using at least 10% of the hectares. So back in 1995, before the introduction of Roundup Ready soybean, we saw 12 different active ingredients being used on more than 10% of the soybean acres, and we saw 8 different sites of action. So quite a healthy diversity in herbicides. This went down to, by 2004, glyphosate was the only herbicide being used on more than 10% of the acres. It started to rebound and actually is going up now, and that's partly through resistance itself, but also farmers realizing they need to do resistance management. And they're adding in other herbicides. They're adding in pre-emergence herbicides to try and bring down weed populations before they hit them with glyphosate. We look at the herbicide companies. The heydays back in the 60s, there were 26 different companies trying to discover herbicides, or were discovering herbicides. And that's down to 6, and actually pointed out to me, Monsanto is no longer really looking at new herbicides. They look at new herbicide traits, but not new herbicides. So we're seeing really only 5 companies now that are trying to identify new herbicides, and they're not really trying very hard after the introduction of Roundup Ready crops. This is a complicated graph, but what we're looking at is the number of patents that at the ag chem industry, the chemical companies, filed in the US for new herbicide. And you see, this is 1996 here, and you see this rapid drop-off of the number of patents they're filing. So they're really reducing the number of herbicides they're bringing to market. And I think this is probably the scariest of all. This is the number of sites of action. And we're not talking about active ingredients. But we saw the synthetic oxins come out back in 1944. And then we see the PS2 inhibitors, the atrazine. All of these different groups were very consistently through these years with all those companies looking to discover new herbicide sites of action. 30 years ago was the last time we saw a new herbicide site of action. So we've had a lot of new active ingredients added on, but they're all me-toos. They're all either ACCase inhibitors, the group 1s, or the ALS inhibitors, the group 2s. So we aren't seeing new ways in which herbicides are attacking the plant. And that's really the big issue we have. The impact of Roundup Ready crops, even though glyphosate is a low-risk herbicide for selection of resistant weeds, a massive area treated with glyphosate has meant that we're seeing weeds selected for resistance quite quickly now. If we look around the world, there are 27 species, and the US leads the way, primarily because of Roundup Ready crops. Also Brazil and Argentina, where they have a lot of Roundup Ready crops. If we look in Europe, this is mainly in orchard situations where we have glyphosate-resistant weeds. Also, these ones down in South Africa are actually in their vineyards. And in Australia, we have some herbicide glyphosate-resistant weeds in our fallow. If we look at the actual weeds, at least I didn't put scientific names here.
There you go.
Rigid ryegrass was the first, and this is what I did my PhD on back in 1980. At that stage, it was resistant to a wide range of herbicides, but it wasn't resistant to glyphosate yet. But it was the first one. It was very prone to resistance. It was the first one to be identified with glyphosate resistance. Goosegrass. Some of the ones that you guys are going to know is horseweed. There are other fleabanes as well. We've got Sumatra fleabane and hairy fleabane. So the fleabanes, the Coniza species, are very prone to resistance. The ryegrass species actually are prone to resistance. We've got rigid ryegrass, we've got perennial ryegrass, and also we've got Italian ryegrass in there. So those three are all loading species. They're actually almost identical species. You can cross them and they produce viable seed and everything. But those three have. The ragweeds, and actually I made a mistake here. This is common ragweed. This one should be giant ragweed. But those two species have evolved resistance fairly early on and are fairly widespread in the Midwest now. The last group that I want to point out that I think is very important, and that's the pigweeds. The tall water hemp for you guys is going to be a problem. Down in the south, they have big problems with palmer amaranth, and we hope we don't import too much of that up here through equipment or cottonseed or whatever way you might import the problem. And then we've got another pigweed species here. So we've actually got four. Spiny amaranth is the other one. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 pigweed species. So this is a cotton crop, and there's no cotton in it, but they put on 4 times the recommended rate when the weeds were 3 centimeters, so just 1.5 inches. And then another 4 times the recommended rate when they didn't get control, and then another 4. So they had 12 times the recommended rate of glyphosate on that, and the only thing that survived there was the palmer amaranth. And this is a shot where you see people hand weeding in like black and white photo, which looks like from the past, but in actual fact it was taken just a couple of years ago. So it's a big problem. They're pulling out weeds, palmer amaranth with 3-inch diameter stems on it. And they just pile it up on the side of the field and hopefully burn it at the end of it. This here is kochia, and I think some of you may have kochia, particularly if you're growing some cereal crops. But this kochia, this field here was sprayed with glyphosate or Roundup, and this is the resultant seed from one kochia plant rolling along, probably stopped, and then the wind picked it up again and blew it this way. And you can see that one kochia plant can produce a line of glyphosate-resistant weeds that you can even see over here is still going. So there's a massive spread of glyphosate-resistant weeds with kochia. Also with horseweed. Horseweed has such a fine seed on it. It's got a little pappus, a little umbrella thing that will take it. And they studied this in Kentucky. I'm not even sure how they did it, but they said it would go more than 15 miles. So it just gets taken by the wind. These are the grasses, the 13 of the 27, so about half of the glyphosate-resistant weeds are grasses. And I think that's a bit of a surprise because I don't think people here consider grasses to be a potential glyphosate-resistant weed. I think you're more interested in the broadleaves. But I would be very, very cautious about the grasses. And maybe the grasses here would be something along the lines of foxtail. I think some of your yellow foxtail, giant foxtail, or green foxtail may end up to be a problem because they have been shown to have resistance to a number of other herbicide groups. 3 ryegrasses, the ryegrass is very prone to resistance, but I just wanted to point out that grasses could be a serious problem. For the broadleaves, 14, so again about half of the known cases, 4 of them are pigweed species. And the one you've got the most of is the water hemp. So water hemp has become resistant to many different herbicide sites of action already. It has become resistant to glyphosate in a number of states. And I think this is going to be one that you'll be battling in the future, not just because of glyphosate resistance, but because it's resistant to most of the herbicides that you have. Giant ragweed, common ragweed, you're probably familiar. I think in this area you have some cases of that with glyphosate resistance, but also with the group 2 herbicides, the ALS inhibitors, the first rate. So, the horseweed as well, I think is something that you need to be concerned about, and for some of you, maybe some kochia. This, I just put this up on the site, annual sow thistle, about 3 weeks ago, I think it was. And this was from a field in Australia where they had glyphosate-resistant annual sow thistle. I know up in Canada, in their cereal crops, there's a lot of annual sow thistle. I'm not sure whether you have it here, but if you do, that's something to look out for. I found it interesting that 24 of 27 cases come from, these I realize you might not know these family names, but these are grasses, these are the composite types, and these are the pigweeds. So 24 out of the 27 glyphosate-resistant weeds come from these 3 families. And there are 460 plant families out there, so these are obviously very prone to resistance. They also account for a lot of the weeds we have in fields, but they only account for about 50 to 60% of the weeds, but they are about 90% of the glyphosate-resistant weeds. In the USA, we have 13 different glyphosate-resistant weeds, Argentina and Brazil. These countries are getting glyphosate-resistant weeds, Roundup-resistant weeds, primarily because of Roundup-ready crops. We have, in Australia, it's more in fallow. In Spain, South Africa, and some of these other countries, it's more in orchards. So the impact of herbicide-resistant crops, glyphosate-resistant weeds are now widespread because it was such an easy solution for growers just to use glyphosate, or primarily to use glyphosate for weed control. The solution industry is coming up with the Enlist or the 2,4-D resistance.